Hello and welcome to My PGCE, a podcast documenting my journey as a trainee teacher, with a special focus on mental health. I am your host, James B. Another week of the PGCE has come and gone. Well, in fact, it was more than a week because last week's episode I recorded on the Wednesday, so it's been 10 days or so since I last recorded an episode. And again, it's been an atypical 10 days. The atypical seems to be becoming the typical on this course. But anyway, I will dive straight into the overview. So I'll start with last Thursday, because that was the day after I recorded the last episode. So Thursday was my first day out of self-isolation, and I was straight back to school, and it was a pretty standard day. I did 3 lesson observations, and after school the trainees had a CPD meeting. So this is continued or continual or continuing professional development. I'm not sure exactly what the C stands for, but anyway, we had a CPD meeting with our professional mentor who spoke to us about accessing and using assessment target data to support planning. And that was a follow-up session from a session on Tuesday, which I unfortunately missed due to self-isolation, but I still took quite a lot from the follow-up session, so that was good. Then on Friday, another day of lesson observations, and then after school I set off up north to visit my partner for the weekend. That was why I had to record last week's episode early. On Monday of this week, it was a university day, and this week was also the first week, for me anyway, given my recent encounter with COVID, but it was the first week where it followed what would be the usual structure. So, university on Monday, school Tuesday to Friday. So yes, Monday was a uni day, and we spoke about professionalism and character, and planning and behaviour. And this all fell loosely under the banner of reflective thinking. But also on Monday, I received an email from the headmaster of my school saying that they had been contacted, I think, by Public Health England, and that they needed to basically send all the students home to take a PCR test. So COVID has been a real problem in my school so far. That's probably where I caught it, I'd say. And there were so many cases that they needed to have a circuit breaker. So send everyone home send all the students, the year 7 to year 11 students, home from Wednesday to Friday so that they could get a PCR test, and they would then resume school in person on the following week to try and get this COVID situation under control. Anyway, that email from the headmaster came through on Monday while I was at university. So I knew then that Tuesday was going to be the only day that I was going to have any contact with the students. And Tuesday again was pretty typical. I had 4 lesson observations. Well, actually 5. So I was scheduled only to have 4 lesson observations, maths lesson observations, obviously. But then for period 5, I went and observed an RE lesson, which I've been looking forward to for a while because I have a background in philosophy, which lends itself to RE, and I wanted to go see what that was all about. So that was very interesting, very different to a maths lesson. And even some of the students who I'd been in a maths lesson with only the period before behaved very differently in an RE lesson, which was really interesting. I'd love to know why. One girl in particular, she was quite She was distracted easily and was distracting others in a maths lesson in period 4. But then in the RE lesson, only a period later, she was a model student. So I'd love to know what made the difference. If you could bottle that, it'd be worth a fortune. Okay then, so yes, Tuesday was the only day this week where the students at my school were in. From Wednesday, they were sent home to do their PCR tests. And so from Wednesday to Friday at school, I mostly did university work. So I'm still working on my maths anxiety essay, and I did a bit of work on that. And there were various other things I did too. So one of the things our professional mentor asked us to do a few weeks ago, but I only got round to looking at it this week. It's called a school task. But basically I needed to speak to my subject mentor or head of department and find out lots of stuff about the curriculum. I had to speak to 3 teachers in my department about their long and medium term planning. And then there are also some various other questions that I have to answer, which is something I'll do during an observation. So it's so I make notes in every observation anyway, but I've been given some boxes to fill in during my next observations to give my notes a bit more structure, I guess, and to help me focus on particular things. But yes, so I emailed my subject mentor and a couple of other teachers in the department and my head of department, asking them for all of that info. And I spoke to some of them about it, and that was very interesting. And then on yesterday afternoon, I had my very first mentor meeting. So I should really have been having a mentor meeting every week, but due to a timetabling issue, which is yet to be resolved, I'm only scheduled to have one every 2 weeks, and I just happened to have missed them all up until this week. So either I was at university and so couldn't attend, or I had COVID and so couldn't attend. But anyway, this week I had my first mentor meeting, and that too went well. We spoke about some teaching that I'll do next week. I'll lead a few starter exercises. I was meant to do it this week, but of course all the students were sent home, so there was no one to do it with. But I'll do it next week instead. And then we also spoke about some of the things to do with that school task I just mentioned. So we spoke about curriculum and planning and things like that. And then after school, I went to staff football, which was really, really good fun. I haven't ran, let alone tried to play football, in a very, very long time. And I've recently had COVID, so I found it very tough, and I'm really aching today. But anyway, it was really, really good fun, and I'm looking forward to doing it again next week. And I think that completes the overview. I feel it was a bit of a messy overview this week, but please forgive me. Okay, now we'll move on to zooming into a few things that I found particularly interesting over the last 10 days. Okay, there are actually a fair few things that I'd like to zoom in on in this episode. Far more than the usual 3 or so anyway. So what I might do, instead of zooming really far in and having a really deep dive, I might just do a partial zoom in, just in order to raise what I think is an interesting question, and then I'll just leave the question hanging as something to think about. So the first, I'd say 4 things are to do with teaching practice. So these are things I've noted down in lesson observations. The first one came in a lesson observation with the head of department, and he wanted his year 7s to answer some questions in silence, to study in silence. And not only that, he didn't want them to ask any questions, not even of him, which is interesting. And he came over to me during this silent study time and talked me through the rationale. He said that if the students whenever they encounter a difficult question, shoot their hand up and ask him for help, and he then gives them help, then they don't develop what he called resilience. So they need to get into the habit of, when they encounter a tough question, being able to muscle through it, sit and think hard and actually draw on their own knowledge rather than just relying on the teacher all the time. And I thought that was very interesting. And it makes a lot of sense. But I guess the risk you run is that they are cracking on with their questions, but getting them all wrong and compounding misconceptions that they have. So I guess the question I'd raise here would be, yes, it's important to develop resilience in the way that my head of department described, but how much time do you devote to doing that? Okay, the second thing has to do with some starter exercises. So one of the teachers often has almost exactly the same starter exercises from day to day. Well, they're the same as far as their deep structure is concerned. Their superficial appearance is different. So they're the same sorts of questions, but the teacher just changes the numbers. And this must be to assess whether students have grasped and understand the deep structure of these questions, to ensure that their understanding isn't only skin deep, which again I thought was a interesting strategy. I guess the only concern here might be differentiation. So if there are some students in the classroom who've already grasped the deep structure of the questions, may have grasped it on their first encounter even, having the same starter questions day after day would get a little tiresome, I guess. But again, I mean, the teacher I have in mind, she's a real expert, and I'm sure that she has a very deep understanding of the needs and abilities of her students. So that's certainly not to call into question her strategy here. Again, I just thought it was worth noting. Another one, and this seems to concern the younger students, so in particular the year 7s. And I think I've mentioned this before. When they're given a question, if they can't get to the answer in one step, they often get stumped and they don't know what to do. And they just stop, basically. So they seem to be lacking the ability to break down the question into sub-steps and then to solve each sub-step on the way to the final answer. And I've been trying to figure out why this is. Well, of course, it's just a mathematical skill that takes time to develop. But something I've noticed with some teachers is that they will, when they're doing a worked example, they won't always write down each step of the working along the way. They'll talk the class through each and every step, often in great detail, but they'll only write down on the board the final answer. So I feel that with some of these students, they actually may be starting to grasp the idea of breaking a problem down into its sub-steps, yet they don't really know how to write those sub-steps out on their piece of paper. So for instance, let's say the question is A and the final answer they're trying to get to is D, okay? They may understand in their head, to some extent anyway, that they need to do step B and then step C and then step D, the final answer. But they don't know to write it down. So they feel that after the equal sign, so A equals, that place there, immediately after the equal sign, is reserved for the answer. They don't feel that they could write down A equals B equals C equals D. Because the spot right after the equal sign, that's where the answer goes. So there have been a few occasions where I've been helping a student, and basically I've just been talking them through the same steps as the teacher had only a minute or so before. And I say, okay, so write down the second step in this problem. And they were like, what? Like where? And I was like, right there, like write it after the equal sign. Here we go. Like, come on, let's write that down. And even then they won't write it down straight after the equal sign. They might kind of write it slightly out the way. They'll write it maybe a little bit above or a little bit below in order to reserve that spot for the final answer, which I think is really interesting. And obviously I'm still looking into it and trying to figure out why exactly that is. But it may be because some teachers, when they're working through examples on the board, they don't write down every single line of working. They talk about every single line of working, but they only write down the final answer. So that's something I'm going to be more conscious of in the future. Okay, one more thing that I'd say falls under the teaching practice heading. My subject mentor has said a few times in his lessons that people should be answering questions in class, like when he asks them, when they're having like kind of a group class discussion about a question, and he's asking questions. He said that the students should be answering questions, and he said that those who are answering questions are getting better marks in homework or in tests or whatever. So he's encouraging other students to ask questions too, so that they too can get better marks. And when he first said this, I kind of thought, this seems to be a chicken-egg situation, because which comes first? Is it the fact that they're answering questions in class that leads to the better marks? Or is it the fact that they're getting better marks and therefore presumably have better knowledge in this area? Is that the reason why they're asking questions in class? Because they feel comfortable, because they know the answer, basically. So my initial thought was, he's got this the wrong way round, my subject mentor. But then I thought about it a little bit harder, which is always a good thing to do. Whenever you think anyone's wrong, it's always a good idea to think about it a little bit harder, to really try and see where they're coming from. And what I think he's trying to do, in fact, is to encourage engagement. So he thinks that if the students are answering questions or feel like they want to answer questions, they're likely to be more engaged in the lesson. And if they're more engaged in the lesson, then, of course, they're likely to get better marks in their homework. So, yeah, I initially thought that he got it the wrong way round, but I actually think he's onto something, basically. And, of course, he's onto something because he's an expert teacher. So that, too, was very interesting. Okay, so now I want to zoom in on something that came up in a CPD, Continue the Professional Development session with my professional mentor. It was in the session on accessing and using assessment target data to support planning. So she mentioned something called the Fischer Family Trust. So I'm going to read you something from their website, just so you get an idea of what I'm talking about. So the Fischer Family Trust provides accurate and insightful information to schools, helping pupils to achieve their full potential and schools to improve. Their online system is used by over 13,600 schools, learning academies, multi-academy trusts. I'm getting tested on my acronyms here. Their estimates are used by teachers to inform the setting of ambitious and aspirational targets for students. They analyse pupil results and pupil progress and provide school leaders with insightful data to support school improvement and self-evaluation. Okay, so in a nutshell, the Fischer Family Trust provides schools with information which teachers can then look at in order to set targets for their students. Okay. And how do they gather this information? What information do they include? Well, one of the things that my professional mentor mentioned was socio-economic class. So this is something that the Fischer Family Trust factor in to their information, because your socio-economic class can apparently determine your performance in school. Children from lower socio-economic classes do worse, for example. And this struck me as very problematic because, well, just a disclaimer to begin with. I haven't done lots of research into this Fischer Family Trust. I'm going mainly off what my professional mentor told me and what I've just read from the website now. But if they do in fact factor in socioeconomic class, I do think that's deeply problematic because, okay, teachers use their information to set targets for their students. And if this information says that a particular student is likely to do worse based on their socioeconomic class, then the teacher will set a lower target for that student. And if the teacher sets a lower target for the student, then the student will no doubt do worse, I think, than if they'd been set a higher target. So we kind of have it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy situation. So the Fischer Family Trust prophesizes that students from lower socioeconomic classes will do worse. The teachers then set those students lower targets, and as a result, the students do indeed do worse. And then the data gathered from that student's performance will reconfirm the fact that students from lower socioeconomic classes do worse, so on and so forth. And that just seems like a real problem to me. So I've just done a bit more Googling, and it does indeed seem like the Fischer Family Trust factors in socioeconomic class, although they call it socioeconomic rank, and it's part of providing contextual value. So basically knowing a bit more about student background. So yes, as I explained, that does seem problematic to me, but I don't know tons about it. In fact, I know very little about it. So if you happen to know more and you think I've got the wrong end of the stick, then please let me know. Okay, so the next and final 3 things I want to zoom in on briefly came from my university day on Monday, the first session, which was about professionalism and character. I'm basically just going to throw out a few questions, okay? Well, actually, no, the first one isn't a question, but it was very interesting. So we were talking about how, well, our session lead, our tutor, was talking about how teaching is such a wonderful profession because it's so varied. And I asked, then, why do teachers often complain about monotony? So I have heard teachers say that it can be very boring doing the same things day in, day out. And I really loved her response. She said that teaching is a cage. You are restricted in what you can do, as is the case in most, if not all, professions, really. But she said that in teaching, even though it's a cage, there's a lot of space between the bars. I really like the analogy, and I'm just thinking about it, trying to figure out exactly what it means. Okay, so does she mean that there's room enough between the bars to escape the cage, to slip out? But then I guess you'd no longer be in the cage and would no longer be a teacher. Or you'd have become some sort of renegade teacher. I don't know. A fugitive teacher, maybe. I don't think that's what she meant. I think she basically meant that even though it's a cage, it's a big cage. Within that cage, within those restrictions, you can do a lot and express yourself in lots of different ways. So perhaps those teachers who complain of the monotony of the profession, maybe in a way they're just stuck in a bit of a rut and they need to look around for new opportunities and perhaps reinvent themselves. I think my tutor would say that teaching is a profession in which you can reinvent yourself again and again. It gives you that freedom. I think maybe that's what she meant by there's a lot of space between the bars. Anyway, I really loved her response. Okay, the second thing was we were speaking about uniform. So again, we were talking about professionalism and character, and the topic of uniform came up. Someone said that in their school, male teachers must wear a tie, which I think must be pretty typical. It's the same in my school. But there was one teacher who refused to wear a tie, but he was a really good teacher, and so no one called him up on it. And so the suggestion there is that you only need to wear a tie, you only need to dress smart if you're not a great teacher, or if you're not as great as this guy anyway. Because if you're really good, if you're like this guy, you don't have to wear a tie, you know. And there was some kind of nodding around the room, like, yeah, I guess when you get as good as that guy, however good he is, yeah, you don't have to wear a tie anymore. And I didn't really like this because obviously teachers are role models, and what example does he set for his students by not wearing a tie? Even if they know that he's allowed to get away with it because he's a really good teacher, still, what example is he setting? And I think the example he's setting is that it's okay to make an exception of yourself. And I think making an exception of yourself can be problematic. I mean, some philosophers may go as far as saying that it's the root of all evil. I don't think I'd go that far, but there is an idea in ethics that if you can't universalize an action, you shouldn't do it. So if everyone can't do it, then you on your own shouldn't do it. An example that's often used is cutting in line. You shouldn't cut in line because if everyone tried to cut in line, there'd be no line and chaos would ensue and the world would erupt in flames. We could take a more contemporary example, or a more concrete example anyway. So I recently had COVID, and what was worse than the illness was being locked up in my flat for 11 days. And I was moaning about this to some of the other trainee teachers, one of whom said, just go out, just go for a walk around the block. You're not going to get caught, you're not going to hurt anyone, no one's going to stop you. Just go stretch your legs. And convincing though his argument was, at least initially, had I done that, I would be making an exception of myself. I'd say that these rules about self-isolation, they don't apply to me. Not at the moment anyway, because I want to go for a walk around the block. I want to get some fresh air and stretch my legs. And even though I may have brought no harm to anyone in doing so, I would have still made an exception of myself. And the issue here is that if everyone who's meant to be self-isolating did the same as me, made an exception of themselves and went for a walk, then it would be highly likely that the illness would be spread to someone. So here we have an example of I shouldn't go for a walk because everyone in my situation can't go for a walk. Because if they did, then something bad would happen. So you shouldn't make an exception of yourself. So that was quite the detour, but returning to this guy, this teacher who's really good and doesn't wear a tie, even though he's doing no harm, he is implicitly teaching his students that it's okay to make an exception of themselves, that sometimes the rules don't apply. And you know what? Sometimes they don't apply. There are legitimate exceptions. I just don't know whether his being a good teacher is a legitimate exception. Because having the mindset that I'm exceptional, I can do what I want, the rules don't apply to me, it's a really dangerous mindset. Again, look at the pandemic. I think one of the reasons Western countries have struggled more than certain Eastern countries is because we're all about personal freedom. It's about being able to do what you want whenever you want it. The individual takes priority over the community. We are all exceptional, which meant we didn't follow the rules as well as we could have done. And we paid the price. So, okay, this has been a real ramble, but what I'm trying to say is that this teacher who isn't wearing his tie is setting his students the wrong example, I think. Okay, last thing. This is a quick one. It won't be a ramble. So in this professionalism and character session, we were talking about character education, how it's important to teach students character, and that character is, what was the tagline? Character is taught, caught, and sought. So students seek character, they can catch character, just by being around someone, they can start to adopt their character traits. But importantly, they can also be taught character. And that, again, falls to the teacher. So what sorts of character should we teach? And we were told basically in this session that everything comes down to morals and values. Okay, fair enough. But which morals and values? Whose morals and values? And are they good morals and values? One set of values that teachers are required to teach, in Britain anyway, are British values. But these can be problematic. I raised an issue in a previous episode about how in certain circumstances they may be contradictory even. And I guess my general concern is that our morals and values govern our behaviour. And I don't think our behaviour as a nation, even a species, has been exemplary so far. In fact, the world isn't looking too good at the moment, in various ways. Well, you know what? I mean, the world will survive, but I think that we're sowing the seeds of our own destruction. We're slowly making our bed, and sooner or later, but possibly sooner, we're going to have to sleep in it. Anyway, I promised that this one wasn't going to be a ramble, and I'm about to start rambling, so I'll stop here. Okay, that's all the zooming in I want to do this week. Now we'll have a quick look at how my mental health has been. Okay, so one of the things I worried about during my period of self-isolation was my sleep routine. Because basically I kind of lost my routine. I was going to bed later and getting up later. And I was worried that when my isolation ended and I was back at school and required to get up at 5:30, I'd just really struggle and I'd be very tired. And tired I was, and tired I still am. But so yes, I had Thursday and Friday at school after my isolation ended. Very busy days. And then the weekend was also very busy because I was visiting my partner. And I think I did get very tired over the course of 4 days or so, because I was struggling to go to sleep anyway, much earlier than I had been during self-isolation, yet suddenly I was required to get up much earlier. So I think I accumulated tiredness over the course of several days. And then it hit me all at once on Monday when I was at university. Just after lunch, I became so tired. And this just happened to coincide with something else that, a bit of a setback, I'd say. Or at least the realization that in some regard I've fallen behind. So in that afternoon session on the Monday, one of the things we were meant to do was pull up the notes that we had been making in our mentor meetings, and we were to discuss them and start filling in a separate form that we have to fill in. But I was yet to have any mentor meetings, and so I didn't have any notes, and so I couldn't really participate in this afternoon session. And I also felt that it wasn't really my fault. I felt that the situation was beyond my control, and I'd fallen behind. And because I was incredibly tired, like I said, this was a bit of a perfect storm. And that afternoon, and for the rest of the evening, I did feel quite down. It's amazing how in those weak moments you start to catastrophize. Like I had a bad afternoon and started to question why I was even doing this, In those moments, it can help to remind yourself of your reasons, why you decided to do this or whatever it is in the first place. That can help, but rarely in those moments do you have the presence of mind to think that rationally. So anyway, it was a bad afternoon, bad evening. I just felt quite low. But sure enough, it passed. Went to school the next day on Tuesday, had a good day. Then after school, I went to the gym, which is the first time I've been to the gym since before I had COVID. So I looked it up and I think it was nearly 3 weeks since I've been to the gym, or thereabouts. And after that gym session, I felt really great. It truly reminded me of the value of doing regular exercise, at least for me. It's a big part of my mental health hygiene. And so, yes, I felt much better. And on Friday, I had my mentor meeting, my first mentor meeting. And there are still a few issues persisting. Like I said, I'm still only scheduled for one mentor meeting every 2 weeks when it should in fact be a mentor meeting every week. So there are still some wrinkles that need ironing out. But it was a good meeting. And I guess this little bump in the road has reminded me that often these periods of poor mental health are just that. They're bumps in the road. They are fleeting. And it's always important to remember that soon enough the clouds will clear and the sun will shine again. And it's so important to remember that, because if you don't, and you're suffering with your mental health and believe that things will never improve, then you've lost hope. And that's only going to make the situation 10 times worse. So yes, if you're struggling with your mental health, always remember that things can improve. And with that mindset, you have the power to make things improve. Okay, that's it for this week. Please get in touch with your thoughts. Even if you think I am talking complete nonsense, please let me know. I'm still very much a beginner in this world of teaching and invite every opportunity to talk with more experienced people and to learn more. So yes, please get in touch. If you like the episode, please spread the word in person and on social media. You can follow the podcast on Twitter @mypgcepod or email mypgcepod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate and review in your directory of choice. Please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/mypgcepod and helping fund both the podcast and my PGCE course. Thank you, and talk again soon.